What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I am going to start here with my preferred build of the Invisible Woman End of Turn deck. Invisible Woman First Steps is undeniably a powerful card that really encourages you to get multiples of her on the field, whether that be through copying her with Frigga or with Moon Girl or through prodigying her to allow you to trigger 4 times. This is obviously a powerful interaction, but there has been a lot of what is the actual best thing to be doing with her because it is about a 6 or 7 card package and you kind of have to fuse it into something else if you want to succeed with it. To me, this is by far the best implementation of it that I have ever played. I think that this is comparable, and you can tell from the name, to one of the best decks ever in the history of Magic the Gathering, the fusion of Splinter Twin and Caw-Blade. It is very similar to that in concept. These were 2 decks that were already quite good. In this case, we have Invisible Woman End of Turn and Victoria Hand stuff, and I think mashing them together means that you just have very few games where you are not doing something that is pretty obscenely powerful. Frigga, Victoria Hand, Moon Girl. That's pretty obscenely powerful. Quinjet into Moon Girling your Invisible Woman lets you play 2 of them on turn 5. That's pretty obscenely powerful. Plus, a lot of the targets for Invisible Woman are cards that you are happy to Moon Girl or copy as well. You have all of these sort of overlapping synergies that make this deck an incredibly powerful point output machine. That allows it to succeed in a way that makes it feel like one of the best Moon Girl decks you've ever played. If you've played normal Moon Girl decks, this is that, but on steroids of steroids. It's not even just better than that, it's so much better than that. Now, there are notable things about this deck that should stick out to you. You are going to be weak to some pretty specific forms of interaction. Let's say you are investing heavily in being an end of turn deck. You are going to be weak to things like Supergiant that can prevent that from actually happening. You care about your cards being face up on the board. Supergiant's very good against that, not to mention some of the more specific Supergiant stuff against end of turn decks that we will talk about in the Supergiant section of this video. But largely, you are just pretty much locked into having a powerful game plan in every game you play, and right now, people just aren't prepared for a deck that is doing that this consistently and at this level of points. It's not always going to be doing something incredibly broken, but I have rarely played a deck in Marvel Snap that is this consistently doing things that are this level of power. Let's say you despise everyone playing Invisible Woman First Steps, which I think is going to be a lot of people out there. The counter to Invisible Woman First Steps is largely Supergiant stuff with Killmonger in it. There are a couple of different reasons for this. The first one is Killmonger is extremely good against the Marvel Boy versions of Invisible Woman First Steps decks, which still make up a large chunk of what you will be seeing on ladder. We'll even talk about those later because I think they are still good enough, despite not being the best Invisible Woman decks in my view, to be on the tier list. I do think that it is worth going over some of the specific Supergiant interactions that you're going to be looking to accomplish against these decks. For example, a Supergiant on turn 5 will allow your tech cards to hit at the end of the game. That is after the end of the turn. So you Supergiant on turn 5 and your Shadow King will get rid of all the points that a Havoc or Thena or Sunspot has accrued. And these decks are not really able to play things like Cosmo to counter you and to prevent that from working basically every time. But it's not just that. If you Supergiant on 5, any card that says end of turn on it won't trigger because it'll reveal at the end of the game. Or if you Supergiant on turn 4, you have this Daredevil thing that will allow you to profitably Negasonic all sorts of things that are reasonably going to be coming down against you. Or if you Supergiant on turn 4, very often their turn 5 is the turn they're going to want to Prodigy an Invisible Woman, and that card's going to need to be face up if they want it to do anything. Largely, the point being made here is Supergiant is as close as this game has to a pure hard counter to what this deck is doing and what Sue Storm in her Invisible Woman First Steps form has done to this metagame. This is the best time to play Supergiant we have ever had, but it does require a lot of little interaction knowledge to perfectly optimize the matchup. Reason I refer to the Invisible Woman First Steps deck as TwinBlade is because I think two of the best decks in the game were already V-Hand stuff and Invisible Woman First Steps stuff, and I think that this is the optimal V-Hand list right now, and I think it's also important to note that even back when those two decks first formed into the Megazord that was TwinBlade, there were still plenty of people who were playing the original versions of those decks, because those original versions were much more customizable, whereas the deck that combines both of them doesn't really have the option to build towards anything, because it's so full of these cards that are required for it to have both game plans in it. It doesn't get to run these interactive cards. So right now, I think when you see a deck like this, what you're seeing is someone who is willing to go minimal on the game plan in terms of power output, but maximal on the game plan in terms of interaction. And I realize that that might sound like a suboptimal thing to do, but I genuinely think this could very easily be the best deck in the game. It's not like Misery Hood is that much farther behind the point output of the Invisible Woman decks. This is probably the single safest pick in the entire game right now. It is consistent, it is strong, it has great interaction for anything you can run into. You will be in every single game you play when you play a deck like this. There is just so much upside to having a cohesive points package, which this deck does in the form of Victoria Hand, the Hood, and Misery, and also a cohesive tech package for any given metagame. This is an absolute barn burner right now. I said I would put the other version of Invisible Woman on the tier list, and I think when you look at this deck and the previous deck, you can sort of see where deck number one came from here. This is, I think, a fine deck, but it wasn't until I played the first deck we talked about today that I really started feeling like Sue Storm might be a problem, because fundamentally, this stuff, I feel at least, is very beatable. I do think it's pretty easy to play, which leads to a greater perception of its power, because whenever a deck is easy to play, it tends to sort of get overrepresented because it is easy to play and powerful. So it's in a similar space to like a Surtur, where it was a thing that everyone was very focused on. It was a thing that was very clearly good, but it was a little bit better the lower down you were because of just how easy it was to play and just how little play skill really comes into winning and losing with this deck, which means that the worse off you are, the better off you are. The worse off you are in terms of rank, the better off you are playing a list like this. I do still think that against players who know what they're doing, this is a relatively mediocre choice. I would rather play either the V-Hand list, I would rather play the combo list, the TwinBlade list that we talked about already. I think that if this was all Invisible Woman First Steps was doing, I would not be sounding nearly as many alarm bells about the card as I might be. But because I think it can do more than just this, because this is sort of a symptom of like early version deck building where just slap all the end of turn cards in it and just see what happens, I don't think she's fundamentally broken, but I think the more refined her package gets, the more it approaches that level. And this is a very unrefined build, and it is still able to compete, in my opinion. Cerebro is one of the few decks that can go point for point with Invisible Woman decks. There are legit upsides to building like this in the current metagame, especially the Invisible Woman decks that are very vulnerable to Killmonger. Like, you'll notice I was running Kyera in my version. Not everyone is doing that, and if they're not playing Kyera, they are losing to Killmonger almost all of the time, because outside of the 1-drops, even with 2 Invisible Woman, that's like a 12 power Thena, that's like a 16 power Havoc. That is incredibly beatable for a Cerebro deck, so that is definitely a very viable way to go about this. One of the things that I think you're going to start to see is just decks that have similar levels of point output, but have Killmonger as well. I think you could very easily describe the V-Hand list as that, and the V-Hand list can be vulnerable to Killmonger in the same way, because they're playing things like demons and things of that nature, which are very easily blown up. This is a long way of saying that I think Cerebro 3 is shockingly well positioned for a deck that lost both Mobius and potentially Invisible Woman, depending on what build of it you were running. This is legit as far as metagame matchups go, and I think a lot of that is because the metagame is starting to move towards this sort of, not necessarily 1-drop centric, but like there are very powerful intensifiers, right? You have V-Hand and copying V-Hand, you have Sue Storm and copying Sue Storm, and when you do that kind of stuff, you really want a lot of cheap targets for that thing, and that lends itself to Killmonger being an important part of metagames for things that are not going to be vulnerable to that. And so Cerebro ends up being not vulnerable to anyone else's Killmonger and incredibly strong into anything that counts on one drop surviving, which gives it a really valuable matchup profile right now. I don't know who came up with this specific build of Silver Surfer, but as someone who has lost to this with Invisible Woman decks, I gotta tell you, that gambit is kinda nuts. Invisible Woman decks are not known for playing a lot of cards early. You are very often gonna be like, if this gambit hits them, they're just gonna lose. If you have priority, you're gonna be able to do some really crazy stuff with gambit. Obviously, this is still a points and Killmonger deck, right? Like, you're gonna see a lot of this package right now because that's what you play if you really wanna challenge Sue's dominance over this metagame. This is a legit thing to be doing, though. Like, I think that Surfer going this direction is really cool, and I think that this is something that reminds me of a deck that was being played last month that sort of fell off after the Galacta nerf that was doing this kind of stuff, but with, like, Dakin and Bullseye. It was being played by a player called Iris, and I haven't seen them on ladder recently, but this is like a sort of honorary shout out to them because this is the kind of deck that I recall her playing as a Surfer Gambit type player. I feel like I've almost been saying the exact same thing every time we get to Discard in one of these videos. Discard is a perennially underrated deck. It is just consistently going to be able to do points on a level that very few things are going to be able to match. It is a deck that can go point for point on its good draws with Invisible Woman. It is a deck that is able to do a bunch of ridiculous stuff and actually output points while doing so. The nut draw here is going to be better than almost anything else. And I think that that is largely why I favor this iteration of Discard, because we are in a metagame that moved away from these very Cosmo Jug heavy things, which were not ideal for this. We're in a metagame that has moved away from these full tech decks that were not ideal for this. And so you end up with a much better positioned deck right now that I think is largely being overlooked because it plays similarly to the Invisible Woman decks, but it doesn't necessarily have any like new cool things going on, so people are just bored with it. I even think the Khonshu builds are pretty reasonable. They're gonna lose to like the fully points-driven TwinBlade style versions because those are just consistently going to get more points than the Khonshu builds are able to match. But I do think that there just is something to be said for presenting problems the metagame is not equipped to deal with, and both of the Discard decks are actually quite solid at doing that right now. I'm not particularly sold on Sera control as an archetype right now, in large part because I'm just not sure how good it is into the decks like the various versions of V-Hand, the various versions of Invisible Woman. I could believe that it's a good deck there, but I think it requires kind of a lot of work to get to the point where it is a good deck in that matchup. Like, yeah, it's got the Killmonger in it, but it kind of needs some other stuff too to go right in my experience when I play against it, because even without the Killmonger, if they're able to get those multiplied Invisible Woman, if they're able to do a bunch of V-Hand stuff, like, it's a little bit hard to match them on points if you are not doing specific stuff. That said, being an Invisible Woman of your own, the other Invisible Woman, I should say, that's very valuable at beating this kind of stuff. Being able to hide a Shadow King behind Invisible Woman, not first steps, is really strong into the Havoc kinds of decks. I think that this deck is legit and good, but I do worry that it's a little bit one note, and so that the people that are able to have mastered these sort of decks that are better proactively positioned are going to be able to do some crazy things to you if they know what you're doing. And I think basically everyone who plays against this deck at a high level knows exactly what the 12 cards in it are and what may happen to them. And so that lends itself, that predictability in an archetype that really doesn't want to be predictable, does sort of lend itself to a potentially worse scenario for this deck than would be thought based on just pure matchups. I actually had a blast playing this list. I feel like it is just the world's most pile of cards that has ever existed. And there's going to be a couple of decks in this vein throughout this conversation where it's just like, these are just a pile of good cards. They have the cards that are relevant to the metagame right now, cough, cough, Killmonger, and they have the other things that generate your own stats, and that's just enough. This is like in the exact same vein as the V-Hand deck, where we have like V-Hand and Tech, and it's like, okay, that's what we're doing here too. We just have a different points package. It's based on buffing stuff. Go play your stuff. It buffs your stuff. Then you play the stuff that got buffed, and you have a lot of points. Oh, exact same thing going on here. Like, there are differences in specifics of card choices, but the fundamentals are very, very similar. It's just a bunch of really good cards. I believe this deck was put together by Unhelpful Yoda. I'm not overly sold on any of this stuff per se, but I do think that it's worth pointing out that, like, you can kind of just do a lot as long as you just stick within this group of cards and play some things that are relevant and understand what you're playing against. You can do a lot of stuff. I'm particularly down on this list for not having Killmonger, but like, you could do a lot of stuff in this space with like Killmonger, Invisible Woman in decks that aren't Sera, probably underexplored. Killmonger, Invisible Woman, and Shadow King in decks that aren't Sera, probably underexplored. But like at baseline, a deck that does Cannonball Mercury, it just actually can't be that bad. I know there's a bunch of other stuff to complain about in a metagame like this, but I'm gonna stand on this one. Cannonball Mercury probably shouldn't exist. Like, I get it. I know. I hit rank 1 with the deck. I get it. I don't think that should be a thing that people are allowed to do for much longer. That's just me. Like, I realize everyone else is mad at other stuff. I understand. I don't enjoy that being such a catch-all mechanic in this game. Speaking of catch-all mechanics, you have, of course, a Wiccan list. Now, this list is notable for being one of the few decks in this game right now that I genuinely feel comfortable playing Mobius in, which is not necessarily an argument for it right now, but this is a deck that can very naturally afford doing that, and I think that's notable, right? If you don't see a lot of use in a Mobius, go ahead, put a copycat in. I don't really mind. You can do whatever you want. Go ahead and put a Killmonger in. I don't really mind. You can do whatever you want. That space, though, like that third 3-drop, being able to be relevant is kind of actually very good for this. The fact that you are priced into running Shadow King as one of your 2s and out of running Shang-Chi because Shadow King is so much more relevant a lot of the time, it's not ideal for a deck that's a Fenris Wolf deck, but just being able to play Shadow King is usually pretty good. It does mean that you have some really, really I have blown it type draws, though. I can't tell you how many times I've missed a 2-drop and then drawn the Wiccan. It's a lot. When a Nimrod deck gets a good draw, it still remains basically unbeatable. Now, there are things that can interact with you, but a lot of them aren't that good. You have decks playing Shadow King, but very few of the decks that are dominant in terms of point outputs are playing Shadow King. Most of the decks that are playing Shadow King are not really going to be your Invisible Woman decks. They're going to be decks, maybe V-Hand is the best points deck that plays Shadow King, but that's not always going to be that bad if you get Nimrod in there. Like, it's not going to be the end of the world. I think that this is a deck that just is so unbelievably impossible to snap into, because when they get their draw, you are just dead if you don't have a Shadow King. Very few decks in this metagame go over the top of this. It is just an absolute beast mode deck, and we are only really being saved by the fact that it just sort of doesn't do anything a decent amount of the times as well. So, you know, you take the good with the bad, but this is almost, in my view, like the Mr. Negative of this format. This is one of the best destroy lists I've ever played. I took a list that Jet, the PF guy, was playing, and I cut PF from it because I thought it would just be better if I wasn't playing PF. And it legitimately was kind of insane. This is a deck that uses a lot of baseline power to buff both Nimrod and Deadpool, depending on what your hand looks like. And obviously, the number one thing you want to be doing with this deck is getting Deadpool as big as he can possibly get. There are some very large Deadpools that you can get in a game like this, and those very large Deadpools, I think a lot of people look at things like Invisible Woman and they're like, oh my god, those numbers are insane. None of them are getting as big as 32. If you get a Deadpool to 32, if you get a Deadpool to 44, Those are just soloing lanes. They are enormously, enormously large. But let's say you're not Deadpool agonying. Let's say you're not Deadpool agonying and then Hulkbustering it and then blowing everything up. And like, I get it. Sometimes you don't do that. You can still do all of that stuff on a Nimrod, and while you're doing it, be summoning Dormammu, whose final spell allows you to blow up Nimrods. There's just really strong lines in this deck, and I have not felt this good about a Destroy deck in basically ever, and you can tell because it's not at the end of this video. Another thing that's really worth talking about here is everyone's least favorite card, Kid Omega. Kid Omega's interaction with Deadpool is really messed up. Like, it doesn't work with Agony the way you want, but if you get a Deadpool dead, Kid Omega will eat it and gain the doubled power. Okay, so that's how it works. In much the same way that Dracula discards Apocalypse, Apocalypse gets +4, and Dracula then gets that +4. If you eat a Deadpool, it will double, and then Kid Omega will get the doubled power. So you really want to use Kid Omega late on your Deadpool if you're stacking up destroys on it, because you can get 20 power Kid Omegas, 40 power Kid Omegas. It can happen. I don't want to be mean to move decks. I think these are very good decks, but like fundamentally, if you play this, you are a 50-50 merchant, you are a Cosmo merchant, you are an Alioth merchant. Like that's what's going on here. Do you want to be a 50-50 merchant? Because you will be able to set up 50-50s against pretty much everything ever. Like there are almost no decks in this entire game that you cannot set up a situation where it is possible to win against them. It's just, there are also almost no decks in this entire game where you cannot set up a situation where you outthink yourself and then totally blow it. Like it is an unbelievably powerful deck if you are literally psychic. And if you are not literally psychic, I mean, buddy, get prepared to flip some coins and hope that you are flipping them well and reading your opponent properly, because if not, you are going to 50-50 every single game you play with this list. Honestly, I kind of love it, but I do not have the mental fortitude for it. I do think that it's very, very cool that in a metagame that I have talked about as being so focused on this Invisible Woman stuff and interacting with it, you can just play a deck with that all cards from last month. Just don't even really worry about it. Just do this stuff. It's all the cards from last month, but it does have, of course, the fairly relevant card of Shadow King. But this is just a different style of points that are not really available to other decks. It's a different style of disruption. I don't really classify this as like a points and tech deck. It's not really the same kind of thing, but having Merlin and Werewolf by Night is extremely powerful. The Agamotto stuff adds a lot of range to what you can do. Being able to clog your opponent's board is quite powerful in certain situations, especially against some of these decks like the Prodigy Invisible Woman decks that are very keen to get 3 things in a lane, and you can really abuse if that is what they are doing and they play it sort of like by the book. This is a deck that is uniquely powerful and uniquely fun, and I think it is a testament to where this game is at, that this deck has basically been good ever since it got made. I believe Honifer put it together for the original, or for Golden Gauntlet 2, made top 4. It's the exact same list that we've been playing since then. Just a solid competitor. It has almost never been bad. It has almost never not been on these lists since then. And that is really cool. Count your days, Hela gamers. Count your days, because soon Stardust is coming to save me from ever having to see this deck again. The depredations of Hela are finally coming to a close. Hopefully, get this in while you can. I think a shocking amount of this deck's viability is down to Gambit, and just Gambit being a good card right now, and just very few decks actually being good Gambit decks. And I wonder how long that's been true, but I feel like it's definitely true now when so many decks are like these sort of setup punchline combo-ish points decks, like the, oh, I need 2 Invisible Women in this exact position. It's like, haha, Gambit, you don't have 1 Invisible Woman now. It actually goes away. And without that Invisible Woman, your whole deck falls apart, haha. And so there's this like legitimate power in the shell right now that I think is in large part due to being just one of the good Gambit decks that exists. It's like, you saw me, I had Gambit in Surfer, right? Like there's just genuine value in being able to be like, actually, the V hand you played on turn 2 dies. because I gambited it and now you don't frigga anything, right? There's just good hits there. It's just how it is. Mr. Negative's in a bit of a weird spot because your gores are like weirdly terrible against some of the good draws from the Invisible Woman decks. So it's like, aha, I've successfully done my thing. I got you. But like your best cards in that matchup are like very, very clearly the Iron Men and not so much the Gores. And so if you don't have like the ability to play Iron Man Mystique a lot of the time, you don't beat them on power because they just don't play a lot of on reveals. And so you're looking at like, I need Iron Man Mystique as sort of the win con that you're building towards. And if you can get to that, you probably are going to beat that matchup. But it's just like the whole point of a deck like this is that it shouldn't ever have to think about stuff like that. Like the point of playing a deck like this is that you don't care what your opponent is doing and you just always win when you do the thing. And that being changed around is a little bit awkward for everyone's favorite 4-1. I am not overly sold on Clog, but I have seen this build of Clog that I think is pretty appealing to me because it manages to put Clog as the interaction half of a deck that is actually doing points pretty reasonably. Merlin combined with the Mysterio stuff means you can get Sasquatches down and then evolve the Mysterios into other things or flush them away for extra energy. Merlin is obviously already good with Sasquatch stuff. And you also have just like, this is just like a sort of Misery's a little messed up in a metagame like this. Like just Misery Hood is just kind of that good that even in a deck that's playing Clog stuff, just having a Misery in there for the Hood is legitimately a thing you can do. What I like about this list is that it has the ability to deploy Clog as a sort of tactical option, but it doesn't have to be a Clog deck. You could spend an entire game of playing against this deck and not see a single Clog card, and that will be because it is just making a billion points with Merlin Wolf stuff. And I think that's really, really good. Like being able to pick and choose as opposed to being locked into being a Clog strategy. I think this deck is fairly similar to the 16-card Anni deck, where I think it's sort of a pseudo-Clog as interaction, but it doesn't have to be that. It gets to be a Merlin Werewolf deck, too. This list was put together by a high infinite player named Eyes Up Here, so shout out to them. I know, you're expecting Destroy to be at this part of the tier list. I'm putting what I consider to be Honorary Destroy, an eminently playable deck that is just putting the fear of God in absolutely nobody. Nobody is like, oh, God, it's Afflict. I can't believe I have to play against Afflict. This is the world's most medium microwave ass deck that we have right now. Ergo, it is taking the Destroy spot at the end of the tier list. It is a spiritual Destroy deck at this point. I am sad because I actually love this. And I'm sad that all these decks that I love end up getting relegated to this spot of the tier list. It makes me sad. But fundamentally, this deck just doesn't do points reliably enough. It just doesn't actually do them. And so if you're not doing points reliably enough because sometimes your deck just doesn't function, you just like, oh, well, here's my hand of 4s. I didn't draw my 2s that make me play cards early, so I guess I don't do anything on turn 3. It's awkward, man. It's just awkward. Like, it's a deck that I genuinely love. It plays one of my favorite cards in the game, AV, and I just can't take it very seriously right now. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. If you made it this far in the video, please remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you enjoyed the video. I still read all of them. Thank you so much. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal. Nothing can change that, and I will see you in the next one.